Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the content guide for the Spectroscope lab. That's what we're working on today, unless you've already finished it. This was kind of what I was going to do on Friday when we didn't have class. So I'll just do it now. I just want to point out a few things. If you have not yet watched the Identify video, I strongly encourage you to watch Identify in the Spectroscope lab folder. That really talks about the Identify section of the lab, which is really what I'm going to focus on today, because obviously that's worth 30 points in the conclusion section. So that's a big, important part of this whole thing. Okay, so you'll start out always with an abstract. So the purpose of making the spectroscope, ultimately, to identify the unknown lights. And then how does the spectroscope work? So that should have some information about electrons jumping around. And then the results, so what lights you were able to identify, or what lights you totally couldn't identify. So again, one nice paragraph, 6 sentences or so, should give you a nice abstract. For the background, these are the questions that you might remember were in the Spectroscope 2 lab packet. At least some of them were. So the difference between a continuous and a discrete spectrum. Why do lines show up in a discrete spectrum? So if you haven't watched orbital jumps, make sure you watch that, because it talks about how the electrons jump and that causes colors. Identify also talks a little bit about why you only see certain colors. So again, make sure you watch the videos that are linked in Schoology. I know it's Mr. Mosher, but they're still good videos. And then we talked a little bit on Wednesday about how scientists are able to use more sophisticated spectroscopes. We talked about a couple of astronomy examples, so figuring out that helium was an element in the sun, for instance, was done using spectroscopy, with a special filter and a fancy telescope, but using effectively the same technique that you used, which is really cool if you like that sort of thing, which I do, obviously. Your data you should already have. You can take screenshots of the data tables from the lab packet. You can make some sort of fancy spreadsheet that does all the calculations for you. I imagine you could figure out how to do that. However you want to present the data is fine, as long as it's neat and organized and labeled. And then make sure you show a sample calculation for one of the wavelengths. You don't have to show every single one, but show for one. If you were able to do the at-home data, make sure you include that. If you weren't able to get all of the data because our time was cut short, then just include the data that you were able to collect. Do this. And the bulk of the points, as ever, of course, come from the conclusion. And so this, again, is where those videos are really going to be helpful to you. You also are welcome to post questions to the Spectroscope Lab discussion board. I'd like you to do it there just so everyone can see the question. If you're not comfortable doing that, then you can always message me. But probably if you have the question, at least somebody else does too. So in the conclusion, the total conclusion is worth 50 points, as you see. And those 50 points come from these 3 different categories. So this whole thing is the conclusion. Here, calibration, orbital diagrams, and identification. So I would say probably maybe organize it into these paragraphs, have a paragraph that's focused on calibration, and then one that's kind of focused on orbital diagrams, and then the rest focused on identification. So calibration, remember that was what you did when you looked at the overhead lights, and then you made a graph of the known wavelengths with versus the ruler location for your particular spectroscope. That allowed you then to make a line. You could input any position on the ruler and figure out the corresponding wavelength. And you had to do that obviously because wavelengths are in nanometers. Rulers are in centimeters. So you had to get some way of converting from one to the other, basically. For the orbital diagram, that's this right here. So that's the idea that like when the electron falls down to here, maybe that's a green jump because it's medium sized. When it falls here to here, that maybe is a yellow, a red. That would be red, sorry. Green, here, I'll draw pictures. So maybe here to here is green. Maybe here to here is red. Maybe if it goes all the way down, that's blue. So those are the ideas of the orbital diagram. So you have these jumps, and the bigger the jump, the bluer the color. So red is a short jump, blue is a big jump. And then you're calculating the energy. So energy, no, I forget that I can. So energy equals Planck's constant, which is h, just look that up, times frequency, which is that little Greek letter. And then you can't calculate frequency directly, but you know that c, which is the speed of light, like E equals mc squared, c is speed of light. C equals the frequency times the wavelength, which you have the wavelength, that's what you calculated. Speed of light is a constant. The speed of light is always the speed of light. So you put your wavelength in here. You know that, so you solve for a frequency. And then that frequency comes up here. You know now the frequency, and you know Planck's constant because it's a constant. And then you can solve for the energy. So it's kind of a two-step process, but it's not terrible. It's just some dividing and multiplying. Okay, so you'll calculate the energies for whatever orbital diagram you decide to draw and label. Pick one with not very many lights. Seems like a logical choice to me, but do whatever you want. So each of those sections, the calibration section and orbital diagram section, are each 10 points out of your total 50 for the conclusion. So like keep that in mind as you're writing this, that those are each 10. The last section, the identify section, is worth 30. So which section is the most important? Yes, identify. So for each of the tubes that you were able to look at, you should be able to identify the elements in the tubes. And to do this, it's discussed in the identify video. But effectively, you're comparing your data, your color and wavelength data, with the spectra for comparison that's posted on Schoology. And I'll put a picture of it at the end just in case you don't know what I'm talking about. So do the best you can to try to figure out what elements you were looking at in the lights, matching up the wavelengths as best you can. If, for instance, in the spectra for comparison, there are 3 wavelengths in the green, and your data had nothing in the green, then that might be an element that you could eliminate. Like tube A had no green, even though the other colors match up, there's no match for green. Therefore, it cannot be whatever. So it's fine if you can't totally identify them. Go ahead and say, I've narrowed it down, or the data indicates that this tube A could either be helium or neon because blah, blah, and blah. And if you can't go any further than that, that's fine. That's, narrowing it down is good. You know a bunch of things that it's not. If you can't even get narrowed down that far, it's fine to say, I've looked at all of these. I know for sure that it's not neon. It's not cobalt. But I can't get it any further than that. Also, totally fine. The key thing in this identify section is that you are discussing wavelengths that were observed and calculated, and then comparing them to the data for comparison. So it's not about necessarily getting the right answer. It's very much about thinking through and sharing your thinking of how you got to the conclusion that you did, how you determined the wavelength that you determined. And then don't forget to talk about this again. Why aren't all colors present in every spectrum, and how can that be used to identify an element? So you talked about that a little bit already in the background, but we like to link things together throughout the parts of our lab report. So do discuss that a little bit more down here as well, okay, and why it can be used to identify it. So, yeah. Okay, I'm going to put the spectra for comparison picture next, and then if I can figure out how to do that, and then I'll be done. Whiteboard. I believe in you. Okay, so here's the document that you're looking for when you want to compare your spectra. So it's called 2019 Spectra for Comparison. It's in the Spectroscope lab folder in Schoology. And this has the elements or the compounds, so carbon dioxide, hydrogen, helium, mercury, neon, xenon, oxygen, calcium, barium, sodium. So you're going to be looking, you can look at the colors, but colors are a little bit subjective. Like, we might see colors differently. So look more at the wavelengths. Look for similar numbers. They might not be exact. So like maybe you have 660 and 490, for instance. Those are still relatively close. I would give yourself a plus or minus of about 5 or 10. And again, do the best you can to narrow down what element it is. If you can't get it exactly and you need to kind of choose between two, then that's fine. Just indicate that in the discussion. Again, if you have any problems, post in the discussion board or send me a message. Just do your best. Try not to spend too long on it. I'm thinking like 2 to 3 hours for this week, because I'm hoping some of it is done already. Yeah, have fun. Do your best.
I believe in you.
Benjamin thinks you're going to do a really good job. So yeah, I'll talk to you later.